Okay, so an acquirer just sent you a letter of intent to acquire your company, also called an LOI. Most of the document is non-binding, so you feel like it's just a casual first step you can sign quickly to keep things moving. But the terms you agree to in this one document lock in 90% of how the rest of the deal plays out. And I've seen this time and time again across M&A transactions worth well over $1 billion in deal value. Buyers know this too, which is why they make the LOI feel like no big deal in the first place. So in this video, I'll break down what every part of the LOI means for you and exactly what you should push back on before you sign. Let's get into it. What is an LOI? The letter of intent gets sent over after early conversations and the NDA, but before anyone has spent serious money or lawyer time on the purchase agreement. You'll sometimes see it called an indication of interest or an IOI, a memorandum of understanding or an MOU or a term sheet, but they really all are referring to the same document. But in acquisition deals in the US, it's almost always called an LOI. An IOI can sometimes be sent even before the NDA. Private equity often uses IOIs to kick off acquisition conversations to get founders' attention by indicating their interest in purchasing their company. And founders sign the LOI quickly because they see the words non-binding and assume nothing's locked in yet, so they treat it as a casual first step to keep the deal moving. But there are a few specific parts of the LOI that are binding the moment you sign. And the biggest one is the no-shop clause, which locks you into negotiating exclusively with this one buyer for 45 to 60 days. The confidentiality clause is also binding since both sides are about to share sensitive information. And if there's a breakup fee in the LOI, which is rare in startup M&A, but it does happen, that's binding too. Reading the price section. You might look at the LOI and see the headline purchase price, but that number is rarely what you actually collect at closing, and here's why. A buyer can offer you $150 million on page 1, but the cash you walk away with at closing will be closer to $100 million. And that's because the other $50 million gets split across parts of the deal that are conditional, delayed, or at risk. So the first thing to look at is how much of the price is cash at closing and how much is held back in escrow. Escrow, also called a holdback, is money the buyer keeps aside for 12 to 24 months to cover any issues that come up after the deal closes. Market range is 10 to 20% of the purchase price. So for example, on a $150 million deal with a 10% holdback, the buyer might hold back $15 million, meaning your cash at closing is actually $135 million. In one of my deals where I represented the buyer, we discovered that the seller had a non-assignment clause with a few of their biggest customers. That meant that once the acquisition took place, those customers could terminate their contracts because the contracts were non-assignable. The buyer required the seller to hold back a larger escrow amount and made the transferability of those contracts extend beyond escrow to ensure that the buyer was covered appropriately. The seller received significantly less cash at closing than they expected, and they were on the hook if things didn't work out with the customer and those contracts. But it ended up working out though. A good LOI lists the specific situations where the buyer can come after you for more than the escrow amount, which are usually fraud, capitalization issues, taxes, and occasionally intellectual property. So if the LOI says standard escrow and indemnity terms will apply, definitely push back because there's no such thing as standard, and buyers use that vague language so they can push aggressive terms on you after you've signed. Next is the working capital adjustment, which can lower the price even after you've signed. Working capital is your current assets minus your current liabilities, and the buyer will set a target amount that needs to be in the business when they take over. If the business has less working capital than the buyer's target, when the deal closes, the difference comes out of your purchase price. And startups often come in below the target because the months before a sale take a lot of cash out of the business between revenue slowdowns because founders are focusing on the deal instead of selling, collections getting neglected, and cash going out the door on operating expenses, plus one-time costs like retention bonuses or advisor fees that come out before closing, working capital adjustments almost always reduce the purchase price. And the seller, often, even when they're informed, usually is surprised by the amount that the purchase price gets reduced. Now, especially in SaaS deals where annual subscriptions are collected, working capital adjustments can be quite large. The reason for this is because the annual subscriptions are collected in advance, but the seller spends the money from the annual subscriptions. But when the buyer takes over the business, they still have to service those customers who paid for an annual subscription, which the seller already got the benefit of that cash collected. This is called deferred revenue. It's a liability. So it's credited in the acquisition as a reduction in the purchase price. In a recent deal where I represented the buyer again, the working capital adjustment was well over $500,000. That's $500,000 less that the seller got in their pocket. Then you've got the earnout, which is part of the price that's tied to hitting performance targets after closing. In the $150 million example, $40 million of that could be an earnout, meaning you only get paid if the business hits certain revenue or profit numbers in 1 to 3 years after the sale, and the buyer structures it this way for 2 reasons. First, it lowers their risk because they only pay the full price if the business actually performs the way that you said it would during negotiations. Second, it keeps you motivated to stick around and help the business hit those numbers after the sale. The problem is that once you sell, you no longer control that business, so the buyer can redirect resources, cut your team, change strategies in ways that make those targets impossible to hit. For example, the buyer might decide to merge your product into their existing platform, which means the revenue that used to be yours now gets counted under their product instead, and suddenly the targets you agreed to are unreachable. Or they cut your marketing budget to save cost, and the growth you expected stops happening. So if there's an earnout in the LOI, you need to push for specific protections in writing. That means defined revenue and profit calculations, written limits on what the buyer can change about the business during the earnout period, and a clause that pays you out in full if the buyer's decisions make the targets impossible to hit. Research from M&A advisors show that founders only achieve their full earnout about 20% of the time, so the safer move is to negotiate as much of the price into cash at closing as possible. By the way, if a buyer just sent you an LOI and you want a lawyer who's been on both sides of these deals to review it before you sign anything, click the first link in the description to book a free consultation with me. We'll go through the price section together, figure out which terms are reducing the cash you get at closing, and put together a list of changes to ask for before you sign. Anyway, back to the video. Deal structure. After the price, the next part of the LOI is the deal structure, which is either an asset sale or a stock sale. In a stock sale, the buyer purchases the entire company, including all the assets, liabilities, contracts, and the entity itself. Once the deal closes, there's nothing left of your company because the buyer now owns all of it. In an asset sale, the buyer only purchases specific assets from your company, and your company itself keeps existing with whatever assets and liabilities that weren't part of the sale. Sellers typically want stock sales because the company is fully sold and you're done. Buyers want asset sales because they get to pick and choose what they want and leave the liabilities behind. The problem with an asset sale is that the company hasn't been sold even though the deal has closed. Your assets are now owned by the buyer, but your original company still exists with contracts, tax filings, employees, and whatever liabilities the buyer didn't take. And depending on your capital structure and jurisdiction, closing that company down can be a pain, with the officers and directors still liable for whatever happens during that process. Now, an asset sale isn't always a problem. It depends on what your company looks like. If you're a small company with few shareholders and a clean balance sheet, an asset sale is mostly just a process that requires you to take extra steps to wind your company down after the deal closes. But there are a few situations where an asset sale gets risky. If your company owns other entities, has employees you've promised severance to, has investors or co-founders who are unhappy with the deal, or if you're close to running out of money, things can go wrong. Specifically, it can expose your officers and directors to fraudulent conveyance claims, which is when creditors argue that selling your assets was an attempt to avoid paying them. So in most healthy startup deals, you should push the buyer towards a stock sale, because a properly structured stock sale gives the buyer the same protections through reps, warranties, and indemnification with far less hassle for you. Not to mention, you can only get the benefit of QSBS capital gains tax exemption for your Delaware C Corp stock held for 3 to 5 years if your exit is structured as a stock sale. Again, you only get QSBS if your exit is structured as a stock sale. Now, I've seen instances where an asset sale just makes more sense for the seller. The instances I've seen this happen most is where a seller doesn't have a choice. They only have one interested buyer, and the buyer is only willing to do an asset sale. If that's the case, by all means, go with the asset sale. If you're ready to sell and your options for an acquirer are limited, and the acquirer you have only will do an asset sale, sounds like that's your best and only option, and you have no other choice. Other instances might be where you want to retain certain liabilities, like let's say you have an ongoing lawsuit that you believe will resolve favorably for you. And then most often in distress situations, asset sales are the only structure that buyers are willing to proceed with. Other terms that decide your outcome. Once you've handled the price and the structure, there are a few smaller terms in the LOI that can still change how much money you take home. The first one is the form of consideration, which just means how the buyer is paying you. Cash is the best because value's locked in the second it hits your account, but stock is where founders can get into some trouble, especially when the buyer is a private company. If the buyer is a private company that's raised a lot of money from investors, the stock you're being offered might be worth less than what the LOI says. That's because investors usually get paid first if the company is ever sold, and that's called a liquidation preference. So in any future sale, the investors get their money out before anyone else does, and the stock you took as payment could end up a fraction of what was on the LOI. The next term to watch is reps and warranties, which are basically the promises you're making to the buyer about the state of your business. The LOI usually doesn't list out every single promise, but it should at least say who's responsible for them, meaning whether the company or the shareholders are personally responsible. A lot of LOIs don't say anything about this, and buyers use that to come back later and argue that you're personally responsible after the deal is too far along to walk away from. So make sure the LOI says clearly that the company is the one making the promises, not the individual shareholders. The last term to look out for, if any part of the price is being paid in stock, is capital structure of the company, or if it's a public company, then registration rights. For private companies, you want to make sure and understand the capital structure of the company to really understand what you're getting. Private company stock doesn't have a market the same way public stock does. With private company stock, you either have to find someone to sell it to, or you have to wait until the company exits or goes public. And even when the company exits, how you benefit from the exit depends on where you sit in the capital structure. Like if the company has preferred shareholders with liquidation preferences above you. For public companies, registration is what makes the stock sellable. And if you're getting unregistered stock from a public company, you can't sell it until the SEC registers it. The buyer will often say they'll register the stock quickly, but they don't actually control how long the SEC takes, so it can take months. And if the stock doesn't get registered, SEC rules say you can't sell it for 12 months, so make sure the LOI has a specific timeline on when the registration has to happen. Now, if you just got an LOI and you want a lawyer who's negotiated hundreds of these deals to look over it before you sign, click the first link in the description to book a free consultation with me. We'll go through the LOI together, figure out which terms are reducing how much money you're going to be able to take home, and put together a list of pushbacks together before you sign. So again, you can book your free consultation by clicking the first link below. And if you want a full explanation of the most important documents when selling your startup, then check out this video next.